Today we are joined by Dr. Michael Kimmage. Dr. Kimmage is a professor of history at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and most recently the author of The Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy. How are you doing this afternoon, Dr. Kimmage?
Very well. Very glad to be on your show.
Great to have you on. So today we're just going to be discussing some of the topics that you presented in your book. Really interesting, especially how basically I have this thing where whenever I see a book that is titled either The Verb of the West or The Decline of the Noun, I will buy it. So the title definitely caught my eye. And I'm also reading currently Rise of the West by William McNeill. Pretty good so far. But either way, to begin, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and the kind of work that you do?
Sure. So I'm a historian of the 20th century United States, and have written a book on the early origins of the Cold War, 1930s, 1940s. That's a history of ideas, and looks into the divergent ways that liberals and conservatives imagined the Cold War when it came into being. I've also served in the U.S. government, spent from 2014 to 2016, 2 years on the policy planning staff of the State Department, where I worked on Russia-Ukraine issues. So, U.S.-Russian relations are a deep interest of mine. And I think all of that is sort of in the background of the book that we'll talk about this afternoon, The Abandonment of the West. There's a bit of diplomatic history in the book, some history of ideas, and also an effort to come to grips with the end of the Cold War, and especially where the U.S. has traveled since 1991. Not getting quite to the present, but the book, sort of ends up around 2016.
Okay. I have not yet finished it. About halfway through. I'm reading so many things right now, but I am really enjoying it so far. And what I really like about it in similar books that I feel like there's been a resurgence in lately, ones that can sort of almost be used to supplement some of the ideas that were presented, for instance, by authors like Arnold Toynbee, but more narrowed to focus on specific topics. Yours, for example, can be used as a supplement for like a lot of those 20th century history books that sort of study the evolution of civilizations, specifically in context with the modern West. I really like making those connections personally between all these different ideas. And yours is definitely very insightful in that regard, specifically when you get to talking about the contraction of the West in the late 20th century. But either way, your new book, The Abandonment of the West, centers around complex and ever-developing relationship between the United States of America, both of people and our civic institutions, and the abstract, often ill-defined idea of the West, particularly in relation to how the U.S. conducts its foreign policy. That said, I was wondering if you would like to share how the idea for this book came about, and if applicable, what, if any, previous writings or theories and intellectuals have influenced the development of your ideas and your broader thesis as a whole.
Great. Well, I can date the origins of this book very precisely. They're a little bit obscure, but perhaps of interest. I think it was 2004 or so that as a graduate student, maybe a little bit earlier, I attended a conference in Frankfurt for fellow graduate students about Cold War history. And one of the papers at that conference was from a Romanian graduate student who wrote about the reception of Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilization, in Romania, which, to Americans is kind of an esoteric subject, but it wasn't for Romanians. It was a very hotly debated book, and what made it problematic for Romanians is that the majority of Romanian intellectuals wanted to see their country in the West, but Samuel Huntington, for his reasons, put the country in the East, because Huntington used a sort of religious model for dividing up Europe, and he separated Orthodox Europe as he defined it from Protestant Catholic Europe, and so Romania, an Orthodox country, sort of ended up on the wrong side of the line, so to speak. And I don't have much knowledge of Romania. My book is not about Romania, but it just interested me that it would matter so much. Why would somebody even care where they fall on Samuel Huntington's map? But then when you look into discussions and debates about the West in the United States and in many, many other countries, it's a very contentious topic. It generates big arguments, it generates big disagreements, and I think the simple reason for that is it gets to the heart of the question of national identity. Where do you configure it? What are the narratives? What are the constructs? What are the relative attributes of national identity in all countries? That's contentious and difficult to determine. So my book was an effort to explore that question in the United States. As you said a moment ago, there are these blockbuster books about civilization, which are very interesting. At the mid-century, it was, Toynbee. You could go back to the 1920s and look at Spengler, that are hugely influential, enormous books. But then actually, when you go forward in time and look at the big foreign policy books of the last 30 years, even if they don't have the word West in the title, even if they're not about decline or breakup, the big books are really meditations on the West. You could start with Edward Said's book Orientalism of 1979. Is certainly an examination of Western culture from a critical point of view.
Would that be considered kind of like a postmodernist perspective? Because I know that's sort of when the influence of the French deconstructionist ideas sort of started coming to the universities.
I think the more relevant frame for that book would be just post-colonial, that it was an effing through American foreign policy, but especially British and French culture, through the lens of sort of a very critical perspective on colonialism, how colonialism shaped the West and how the West used its culture to impose itself geopolitically. And Said wanted to, both piece that together and to criticize it. You can move forward in time to Fukuyama's The End of History, which is very much a book about the West. That's in the triumphalist mode. And then we've already mentioned Huntington, but he has The Clash of Civilizations, and he has a lot to say about Western civilization in that book. And you could even go up to very recent history. The theme of the Munich Security Conference, not this year, but in 2020, was Westlessness.
YouTube recommended some of those videos to me. I haven't got around to watching them yet, but I put them on like a playlist. So.
Yeah, no, it's it's a very prominent forum for the discussion of diplomacy and international affairs, and it's striking that they too were looking into the topic of the West. So it's kind of everywhere you look, and I don't think of my book as in any sense the last word on the topic. It's sort of, as books go, kind of the first word on the topic, because you won't find too many historical studies of the United States and the West, and so there's a lot of ground that I don't cover, and there's a lot still to do on the topic. But I wanted to sort of jump in and try to offer a narrative and a story about how this notion crystallized in the United States, what it meant for American foreign policy during the Cold War, and of course it's still ongoing what it means in the present. But I do try to speculate about the idea of the West after 1991, sort of George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Biden is beyond the scope of the book, but that too is an interesting conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So referring to the idea of the West in general, it should go without saying that as a label, it's incredibly ill-defined, especially today. And it's one of those terms that can be very nebulous due to different people using it in reference to different concepts. Like, for instance, some will invoke the term as like a catch-all reference to just civilized society in Europe as it has existed from classical Greece onto this day, even though there are completely different metaphysical worldviews between us today and them back in the times of Aristotle. And then some people will just use it to refer to the free world or ideological blocks similar to the Cold War, or just the high culture in general. And then the left and the right, they'll both ironically refer to it as like a fundamentally white culture, albeit for different reasons. But so with you, just to clarify, what do you mean when you are talking about the West as a concept? How would you define the West?
Well, I think you're entirely right that it's an incredible grab bag of notions, ideas, principles, and it matters for culture and it matters for foreign policy, and you also get very different discussions in those two worlds. In the DC foreign policy world, the West is usually very positively themed. It's not whiteness, it's not empire, it's another word for the transatlantic relationship. And then you go into academia and you have much more discontent and sort of concern about the word and what it signifies. So, sort of going back in time, if you start at the very beginning, the word West in the English language, and it's similar to Occident from Latin, means the place where the sun sets. And this, of course, is parallel structure to the East or the Orient.
German Abendland, the evening lands.
We're familiar with the Japanese flag and this notion of Japan as the land of the rising sun. There's a kind of East-West dichotomy that's there as an essentially geographic notion. The ancient Greeks, since you mentioned them, did have a notion of themselves as the West, and they contrasted themselves to
The
Persia.
barbarians, yeah.
Correct. Yeah, either authoritarians or barbarians. You have the breakup of the Roman Empire into Eastern and Western halves. You have sort of Byzantium and Western Christendom, and then more to the point, because it's more modern, you start to have a notion of the West in the First World War, which is not exactly geographic because it's sort of all the enemies of Germany and Austria were the West, so they're a certain alignment of the West with democracy, imperfect. You get that again in the Second World War, and of course it has an important Cold War pedigree. But since you asked for my definition, the one that I use in the book, and I try to acknowledge that this is very selective and it's a choice, and you could write many other books on the West that would look very different if you used a different definition. But the one that I use for the book is a narrative that, first of all, connects the United States and Europe, and secondly, that superimposes some idea of liberty onto this relationship. So it is, you could say, the kind of more optimistic, the brighter reading of the West, interpretation of the West, but I find it's the one that's most consistent with the makers of American foreign policy. In other words, this is the idea of the West that they have tended to have, and I think that would be true for Joe Biden in the present. It's not true for Donald Trump, and we can get into that a little bit later, but it would be true really for most American presidents who use the term. So starting with Woodrow Wilson and throughout the 20th century, the West is not really much in currency until the 1880s and 1890s. So you will struggle to find many references to the West in foreign policy discussions. So it has you could say, taking a long view, it has a kind of a recent history, really.
Yeah, I think in a way it almost seems like it's a very perennial concept, but depending on the time, they've used different labels to refer to it, depending upon how identity was based at the time. Like Western Christendom was, I think what Spengler would have called like the springtime phase.
I think perennial is a terrific term because you can't have a West without an East. And if this term doesn't just describe a certain set of cultural differences, if in foreign policy it describes a conflict, that sort of back and forth is very, very different over the years. So if the U.S. sees itself as a defender of Western values against Nazi Germany, that's going to, sort of be one relationship. If it's against the Soviet Union, it's another relationship. If it's against, Islamic terrorism, it's sort of another candidate that never really stuck, but that would be yet another relationship. And if it's against Putin's Russia and China, it's a very different category. So I like your term perennial. It's something that evolves over time, although it's so recurrent that there must be something quite deep there because it just seems to come back. So
during the Enlightenment, they just called it civilization.
Correct. That's correct.
And then even up until like Mill, he was referring to civilized people versus the barbarian. Civilization and barbarism, I think, was his treatise on that. But either way, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Because you do see today, and I know you talk in the book about, for instance, Western history courses that began especially after the First World War in order to reinforce these ideas and the existence of a tangible West itself. But what's interesting is like a lot of those courses refer to the West as sort of this continuous society that began back right before classical Greece and extends to today. Whereas then you'll have others who will be like, no, our way of viewing the world really has its origins in like the 8th century, for instance, or the combination of Greco-Roman metaphysics with Christianity. So like, what indeed hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? Where would you stand on that side of the argument?
Well, it sort of depends for which purposes. As a historian, I think, again, emphasizing that my book is about foreign policy, it's certainly Greece and Rome that form the most important part of the sort of Western imagination, such as it was from, say, 1900 to 1980, the one that would have been formed by Western civ curricula at elite American universities or in some cases at prep schools, and just by the sort of common discussion. So for a George Kennan, a Dean Acheson, and Averell Harriman, for those who were the creators of a sort of post-Second World War American foreign policy, they had a very distinctive notion of the West, and that for them was not really Christianity. That was there for all of those figures, but it was not fundamental for them. It was some notion of classical antiquity, and of course a republican form of government, which sort of is in between Greek democracy and and the Roman Republic. That matters a lot for the founders.
This is the golden mean.
Right, that matters a lot for the founders of the American Republic. And as you know from the book, I try to look into architecture quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason that you have so much neoclassical architecture in D.C. all the way to the Ronald Reagan building, which was built in the 1980s, is because of this fascination that the founders had with classical Greece and classical Rome. And so they sort of planted that seed, and it's sort of always been present in the American civic sensibility. So, Christianity for American Catholics, perhaps you get a kind of Western narrative there, but I think in general the politically important narrative is the one that's attributed or that begins with Greece and Rome.
Okay, yeah, and about back to your comment about the founders drawing from the traditions of Greece and Rome in the architecture. You can see that. I think one of the best examples, even one of the most surreal, is the Capitol Rotunda. If you see them, they're basically deities. Then there was a statue of George Washington. I know it was torn down 10 years after it was built. But I heard something recently. It may have been one of Trump's last executive orders, something about they wanted to return to the neoclassical style of federal buildings.
He formed a commission, which has since been dissolved, but a commission to sort of restore 18th century or neo-18th century style, classical style, Georgian style, sometimes it's called, to American civic architecture. It's interesting. Trump himself was introduced as the bodyguard of Western civilization at the 2020 Republican National, sort of nominating convention. And so Trump in the West is itself a very, very interesting topic.
Then there was his Poland speech too back in 2017, Absolutely. Which was seen as controversial, I know. And speaking of the controversy surrounding that, I think that might be a good point to lead into, especially on the right and the left divide, that sort of that dialogue, that argument about what the West is, whether it is a useful concept, a moral force for good, what is its. Just do you think you could go into details sort of about the history behind that?
Let's start with the left, and then we can focus in on the right, because there is a great deal to say about this topic. The really important preliminary point for understanding where the left and right have arrived in the last, say, 10 or 20 years is that from, say, the 1940s to the early 1960s, there was a very strong bipartisan consensus on American foreign policy. It didn't mean that you had no dissent about foreign policy in those years, but for the two political parties, a commitment to NATO, a commitment to the transatlantic alliance, a commitment to the basic Cold War foreign policy, that was taken for granted. And whether it's Eisenhower or late stage FDR or Truman or Kennedy, they're speaking to a degree in one voice on foreign policy.
The only exceptions I can think of would be the old right, like the Taft.
Yeah, I mean, you have Henry Wallace, who was FDR's vice president, who I think felt himself to be, a critic of the Cold War policy, that it was too harsh on the Soviet Union.
Then wasn't there the America First Society, but then they dissolved because they were okay, we were attacked. I know JFK was part of them at one point too, and
that's correct. That's all out there. It's not insignificant, especially because later, figures like Donald Trump will sort of pick up on some of those themes. So it's not historically irrelevant, but it's marginal in those years. And then something really changes in the 1960s. So for the American left, the key impulse is the Vietnam War. That just prompts a major rethinking of American foreign policy, very understandably, because they rightly saw that the war was going very badly, and they tried to think through why that was the case. And that began to intersect in the 60s and early 70s with the various rights revolutions that were taking place in progressive America. And that was also a sort of rethinking about what the United States is. And so you get, on the one hand, a sort of critique of racism within the United States, of prejudice, intolerance, white supremacy. I don't know if that was a common term in the 60s, but that's what they were talking about. And that's happening
again, different terms over the years to describe different concepts.
Terms over the years, yes. But at the same time that those questions are being posed about the nature of American society and how prejudice can be overcome within the United States, you have all of these questions about American foreign policy. And there were a lot of thinkers in the 60s and 70s on the left. Martin Luther King would be one, and many others, who connected the Vietnam War to problems at home. That the reason that the U.S. was in Vietnam was because it was a society so driven by prejudice and had adopted sort of the imperial instincts of 19th century Europeans at their worst, that you could explain the mistakes abroad by looking at the difficulties, contradictions, and prejudices within the United States. And so you get a rethinking of many things on the left, and it eventually sort of finds a home, that rethinking, in academia. And systematically, you see in American academia a kind of questioning of the literary canon, of what's taught, of what the narrative is, and a very strong sense on the left that it really must be broadened. So either you sort of do the West plus other tributaries of global civilization and multiculturalism, or it's somewhat of a more radical position, but there are many people, I think, who adhere to it at the present moment. You really want to get rid of this notion of the West altogether, because there's no separation of it from white supremacy. There's no separation of it from empire.
Yet there's also no separating it from things like women's rights and things like that too. It seems like there's a lot of nuance that both sides really aren't paying attention to.
Well, I certainly agree with that, and you can find contradictions and sort of blind spots on both sides of the political spectrum. But that's sort of the mood that you get over time, that the West is the culprit, and that the U.S. is burdened by its commitment to the West. I'm still sort of trying to recreate a kind of left progressive take on these questions, and we would just be better off if we came up with another set of frameworks, if we came up with another narrative. And interestingly, as you know from the book, I spent quite a lot of time on Christopher Columbus statues. Proliferated throughout the United States in the 19th century. Naming things like District of Columbia, Columbia University, Columbia River.
Until I read that, I never really put that together, especially the part with Columbia, like the personification of America. And I know back in like the late 1700s, there was an attempt to write like a national epic that wasn't very popular. It was like the Columbiad or something. Yeah,
the Columbiad. That's very, very true. And it used to be Hail Columbia was the sort of first version of an American national anthem. And then in 1893, it's more common to refer to it as the Chicago World's Fair, but it was called the World's Columbian Exposition, and it was a celebration of the 500th, or what was it then, 1492 to 1893, 401st anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. And to sort of complete the point and to provide a bit of symmetry, you have this strong investment in Columbus, a strong investment in this narrative that the United States is a Western country and is part of the Western story. In the 1890s, for American elites, that was a good thing. You sort of flash forward 110, 120 years, and you see that that's just very controversial or undesirable. And indeed, in the last year, you've seen the toppling of quite a few Christopher Columbus statues, because it represents the narrative that's just not desired on the left, and that's a work in progress. It's sort of unfolding before our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Is it? I remember I was reading. Oh God, I forget where I was reading it. I forget where I read it, but I think it was an article. I think it was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about a lot of the earliest criticisms of Christopher Columbus, like when they really began. It was actually apparently rooted in anti-Catholicism, which is interesting. I thought the argument, because I know, I think the establishment of Columbus Day, there was like some sort of political reasons, like with Italian Americans. Yeah,
no, that's certainly true, and he's always, or was. There's a great Sopranos episode on the topic of Christopher Columbus statue, and sort of different groups disputing that statue. Although for the early republic, which really is crazy about Christopher Columbus, the virtue of Christopher Columbus wasn't that he was Catholic. The virtue of Christopher Columbus is that he wasn't British. So Americans were looking for a hero that they could celebrate, that they could sort of affiliate with, but that wasn't John Winthrop or sort of somebody from Britain.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, there was this strong desire to sort of separate the country from its British roots. Now, for the right,
no, it's like I just want to say real quick, like, that they must have really hated being associated with Britain when the Calvinists are going to embrace a Catholic explorer as sort of their
politics, right? How it moves to these marriages of convenience. It's always sort of amusing to watch. But the story on the right is more complicated to tell. I find the story of the left, and there are many progressives who don't entirely fall into the categories I was laying out a moment ago, but to me at least it's sort of a coherent, comprehensible story. The right is a lot more difficult to figure out in this respect. It's hard to be a conservative, at least in the United States, and not to be pro-Western in some way, some form or fashion.
I've noticed that means that, but that means different things to different conservatives. Like you'll ask somebody like Jonah Goldberg will have a different position than Pat Buchanan, for instance.
Exactly. No, you've put your finger on the heart of the matter. So I'm not aware of, I mean, maybe sort of extreme American nationalists, to the extent that these people are engaged in the world of ideas, perhaps they would sort of reject the West or a connection to Europe because it would seem, sort of un-American.
I know some more radical libertarian types do, like anarcho-capitalist types who are very against basically having anything to do with a sort of global kind of interconnected order whatsoever, just very hyper-individualistic and against any kind of form of collective. Yeah.
That's very interesting. That would be a fascinating thing to study and to write about, because libertarians, at least the sort of maybe more conventional libertarians, stemming from Hayek and from sort of many European thinkers, what we refer to as the Austrian school of libertarian economics, tend to have a sort of positive notion of the West. The West is what upholds the idea of the individual, and there's sort of these Western liberties, and it's necessary for us in modern times to kind of defend those against the state.
Exactly. That was one of the main impetuses behind the road to serfdom. I mean, Hayek basically saying this is why we can't go in this direction, because then we basically end up destroying all the principles that we hold dear.
A sort of violation of Western civilization. So you get that among libertarians. But the way I would characterize the right over the last 50 or 60 years is that you have a very subtle division on the right that the Cold War kind of obscured in the 1960s and 70s. And so in my book, I take up an interesting text by James Burnham, who was the sort of most important conservative pundit on international affairs and a key editor at National Review. He was actually a man of the left in the 1930s. He moved to the other side of the political spectrum at some point in the 1940s. And he writes a book, publishes it in 1964, called The Suicide of the West.
Yeah.
So there's another one of your title books with
so there are a lot of ideas of Burnham I don't necessarily agree with, but if I had to pick like my favorite 20th century conservative intellectual, my opinion, definitely one of the most well-written, one of the most interesting in terms of how he presents his ideas. So
he's very formidable and was sort of an excellent writer for sure, and very bold in the arguments that he made, especially in that book. But the reason it sort of intrigued me as a book of 1964 is that the problem for Burnham in that book is not exactly the Soviet Union. Obviously, he's against the Soviet Union and sees the U.S. as needing to fight the Cold War. But
progressivism.
What's really worrying Burnham in that book is liberalism and as you say, is progressivism. And he associated that with a kind of unpatriotic globalism, a kind of bland technocratic internationalism, and really felt that liberals were becoming incapable of defending the West as a civilization. And his sort of fear is that if you're unable to defend the West as a civilization, that's sort of step one. Step two is that you're not going to be able to defend the West in the world of geopolitics or foreign policy. And I'm intrigued by the link, I haven't been able to research it to my own satisfaction, between Burnham in the 1960s and the books that Pat Buchanan starts to write in the 1990s. But you have a book that Pat Buchanan publishes, I can't quite remember which year, maybe it's 1998 or so, but it's after he runs for president in 92, called The Death of the West. And he does. That's actually one
I've not read. But.
Right. Well, it's well worth reading as an insight into American foreign policy in the last 5-10 years. And he does cite from James Burnham in that book. I mean, the title is very similar: The Suicide of the West, The Death of the West. But he takes some of Burnham's arguments a little bit further than perhaps Burnham himself might have.
I assume he takes it more in like an anti-immigration perspective.
Precisely.
Because I know Burnham was like. Because I know conservatives back in the 60s were very pro-immigrant. They were the pro-immigration ones at that point. So
immigration, I don't remember being a big theme for Burnham, but it was not a problem for him, and it was not really something that he seemed to worry about. But for Buchanan in the 1990s, one major concern is immigration. So the idea that we've sort of lost control of the borders and we're screwing up the culture, that's one important claim for Burnham. But there's also free trade, and this is where Burnham really does resonate in Buchanan's writing, is this sort of globalism or internationalism, that the U.S. is looking internationally and has become part of an elite international financial project. And what it's forgotten to do is to sort of look at the common people of the United States and sort of defend their culture, defend their interests. So that's in part what he means by the death of the West, Buchanan. And it's absolutely striking that although there's a sort of 14, 15 year lag time between the publication of those books in the 90s and the candidacy of Donald Trump in 2016, that Trump hits almost all of those same themes in 2016 on the campaign trail. Certainly immigration, certainly the subject of borders, certainly the subject of free trade, and also this sense and accusation, not just of liberals or Democrats, but this accusation that
conservatives,
the whole political elite is just sold out to globalization and to
no, it's because
financial markets and
for the longest time, free trade was like one of the most important conservative issues. And
yes, that of course deserves, and I think we'll get in the future, lots of attention in terms of understanding how that shift occurred on the Republican Party. But I haven't been able to package all of this in a neat argument about what happened from the time of Burnham to the time of Trump, and I think the Republican Party it's just unclear. I mean, if Nikki Haley or DeSantis or Marco Rubio would get the nomination in 2024, my guess is you would see a return to a sort of not quite a George W. Bush, but sort of more traditional Republican foreign policy,
liberal internationalist kind of.
I think so. Certainly, where Russia and China are, geopolitical foes, and the NATO alliance in connection to Europe is very important, and the U.S. needs to stand up for its values. I think you would get those messages. So maybe if that's true, Trump will be sort of a flash in the pan, and you don't want to exaggerate his importance. On the other hand, I think the way in which he really redefined the West is just fascinating. So it's not about transatlantic partnership. It's not about sort of liberal principles. It's really not about what I write about in the book. And so I call him in the book the first non-Western president of the United States. And the West for him, it's much closer to, say, a current Polish or Hungarian, sort of, I don't know, far right European.
I mean, he's like, he was a fan of Orban, so
yeah, it's a tradition, it's a heritage. Islam is a problem if it becomes integrated into the West, and there's a need to sort of Christianize the notion. And that, you mentioned Trump's speech in Warsaw in 2017 is very important. He goes to Warsaw itself, a place where ethnonationalism plays a role in national politics, and
it's definitely a lot more European countries. Ethno-national is definitely a lot more acceptable there, yes. And it's probably, the reason is probably because the United States was fundamentally built on ideas and abstract principles, and identity wasn't tied to like particular ethnic group, whereas it's a little different in Europe, where you have like these actual nations with these groups and stuff.
Yes, of course, the racial politics of the U.S. do play into identity and have also a long career in shaping the foreign policy imagination. But it is very true, if you compare the United States to a Poland, that this notion of some soil, language, a national church, all of that would just not work in the sort of American constitutional order. So it's
just not natural.
It's unusual that Trump, sort of struck some of those notes, or maybe not in terms of where the U.S. currently is. But it's striking how few presidents before him sort of worked in that paradigm. But that's why I think that Buchanan and Burnham are so important to read. We really need to broaden our sense of what goes into American foreign policy. And since we're both sort of, in or near the Beltway, there is a tendency in Washington, D.C. to create its own conversation about foreign affairs. And just sort of think that's the conversation the country at large is having. And one of the helpful things about Trump in terms of his election was that he showed what a distance there is between Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country. And that's something that we all need to puzzle through.
Yeah. I would agree with that. Definitely 2016 was, the past 4 years were definitely a roller coaster, especially with in regard to foreign policy, because one of the things, like I didn't vote for Trump in 2016, but one of the things I did actually like about what Trump was saying was about he seemed like to be advocating initially, at least, for a more realist style foreign policy, but then it turned out he really didn't even have much of a foreign policy. In the end, it was just kind of shuffling troops around and then bringing Bolton and then firing Bolton. And then it just seemed like he contradicted himself with all the different people he was hiring. So.
Yeah, I mean, to stick within the framework of my book, I mean, he did articulate this notion of the West. And at the beginning, I think 2016, there was a sense where you had Brexit in the summer of 2016, and then you had Trump's election, and you already had, sort of governments leaning in this direction in Poland and Hungary. And maybe this was really the wave of the future, that there was going to be a kind of new sense of politics and a new foreign policy. And maybe there's still something to that new sense of politics. I mean, called populism, I don't think that's the clearest of definitions. But whatever it is that's meant by what we refer to as populism, it's probably here to stay in some form or fashion. But the foreign policy never gelled at all. And a lot of what Trump said on the campaign trail, and a lot of what he said as president, had almost no bearing on what he and his government were doing.
Oh, so, totally. Yeah. No, it seemed like, I mean, because rhetorically speaking, he ran a fantastic campaign in 2015, 2016, and then never lived up to like what, he got 2 Supreme Court judges or 3 conservative Supreme Court judges. I can't think of really anything else that he really fulfilled on promise wise. But yeah, no, he definitely governed very different than the type of person he was presenting himself as when he was on the campaign trail initially.
Yeah, no, he's not a person whose words are especially effective guides to his actions. So you have to always parse the two, and it's analytically, it's a difficult job. But I'm not sure the motivations of the man himself are especially complicated. But you sort of configure the words with the actions. That's very, very tricky.
Yeah. I don't think anything more really needs to be said about that. But so I actually do have a question for you that kind of came to, and I guess it's a little paradoxical. I don't know if that's the best word to use, but so we were talking about how you see a lot of people like forces on the left who are for integrating all of these other traditions into ours, mixing them and going in a more universalist direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yet at the same time, they're basically for like, decolonizing, making these like independent nations, autonomy and self-rule, and basically what you'd have like some people, certain elements of the right would call quote unquote globalism, in terms of like the international relationship aspect. But I mean, of course, with self-determined nation states like in the third world. But what I find interesting about that is it seems like, they might see it as sort of as de-Westernization, trying to de-Westernize and try to create something new. But in a sense, isn't that entire idea predicated on sort of Western ideas? Like the idea of universalism is a fundamentally Western idea. Like, I mean, I can't think of anything more Eurocentric than the presupposition that the values of the Enlightenment that came out of Enlightenment Europe are universal to all cultures everywhere. And also the ideas like nationalism and democracy. So isn't, in a sense, aren't they trying to, could you at least maybe make the argument that they're unintentionally pushing for like a different form of Westernization?
Well, it's certainly a very interesting question. I think it also a lot depends on which corner of the progressive world you're thinking about. So, maybe I'm trying to answer your questions, say a few words about Biden and the Democratic Party, which does define the progressive world sort of in action institutionally. But of course, there are many to the left of Biden, and it's interesting to speculate about where they stand on these questions. I think you're right in the sense that for sort of Biden progressives, those in office, those who are wielding power, there are many Western institutions and Western norms that, whether they call them Western or not, they're very committed to. So I'm not sure if the United Nations is a Western project per se. Some of the rhetoric would suggest that it is. Some of the rhetoric would suggest that that it isn't, but it does come about, because of Woodrow Wilson's advocacy, the advocacy of others. And for Woodrow Wilson, of course, the United Nations was a Kantian project. It was the realization of certain enlightened political principles in the international sphere. So I think, the United Nations and those kind of multilateral institutions are very congenial to the Biden administration. So yes, I think you do have a kind of internationalism, a progressive internationalism that maybe is a little sheepish about calling itself Western these days, but is basically Western.
Like Atlanticist maybe would be a better.
Well, Atlanticist for sure when you're talking about
Euro-American, yeah,
and the transatlantic alliance. There I think it's easy to see the Western pedigree of those institutions, and that for Biden is paramount. The relationship with Europe is probably the most important piece of his foreign policy. On the other hand, when you look at other progressive voices, I think that there's a way in the way in which what you're describing is sort of not entirely true, or maybe not true enough. So there's a sense of postcolonial solidarity that emerges. That there's a need for solidarity, in opposition to the legacy of European colonialism. So in this sense, if you would look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, and there's writing in this vein,
hot topic right now.
Weeks, the idea is that the Israelis are sort of the settler colonial white power that's was granted its position in the region by the British Empire. It's sort of illegitimate, and the goal for us as progressives is to express solidarity with the Palestinians, who are sort of the victims of racism, and in the scheme of things, the victims of colonialism and imperialism. In that sense, I'm not sure exactly how widespread that is on the left. I think it's pretty widespread. I don't think ideas of Western vintage are all that important, although a lot of anti-colonial ideas, have their connections to Western thinking and Western philosophy. But I think that there is an idea of post-colonial solidarity that takes one beyond the Western purview. I think there's also, and I write about this all too briefly in my book, in the 1950s you have the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, and this was the Egypts of the world and the Indias and Indonesia and sort of other very important, populous, extremely significant countries that sort of
so this was like right after the abolition of those mandates, the colonial mandates.
Right. It's a period of decolonization, and basically they were very frustrated with the Cold War and felt it offered them a binary that was very European in nature, and they just wanted to see a different kind of international politics. Now there's been difficulties building on the momentum that was created in the 1950s about this other kind of international politics, but it's real and it's important, and that is not, I would say, sort of Western in origin. So, it depends on your viewpoint, it depends on your subjects, but there is a zone out there that I would say is important to international affairs and not Western in orientation.
Mm-hmm. And another thing I wanted to bring up, I thought your the opening chapter to your book, it was very strong. I like the part about like just how you kept it was the topic of the idea of the Crusade, and about how you started discussing how it's just this motif that has always existed within Western culture. And it's interesting that I thought that was really interesting too, and you could kind of link that back to stuff that like people like Spangler were talking about, how sort of the West's obsession to infinitely expand itself in all directions and to conquer boundless space, and also something that fascinating, because you're also talking about George W. Bush, about how it was controversial. He was using the term crusade. And about how if you really think about it, there's very little difference between a lot of these regime change wars in the Middle East and the Crusades in the during like the High Middle Ages. The only difference is that the only difference is really the Enlightenment, because it was Christianity was the defining like ethos back then in war, but then society those ideas became secularized, naturalized, rationalized, and Father, Son, Holy Spirit became life, liberty, property. And basically those were crusades to spread the religion of democracy, it seems like. And I feel like that is a very, and then you're bringing up the ideas of Columbus too, about how it was his vision and the vision of the explorers. Their mindset was based on that same, just that sort of desire to expand for the sake of honoring God, but question wise, in relation to that, I think that was kind of a long lead up, but do you see any new, at least within the recent, at least since you wrote that part in your book, sort of new conflicts that you would see as expression, as more recent expressions of that same Crusader motif?
Definitely. So I'll end on that, end my answer to your question on that note. But to sort of explain why crusading is so prominent in the book, why it's there at the beginning, I would say that I wrote this book as, in effect, a defense of the West. It seems to me like it's not a very popular idea at the moment and has quite a few enemies on the right and on the left in ways that we've already discussed. I think that there are a lot of drawbacks to the American commitment to the West in the 20th century, and most of those center around sort of race and ethnicity, and I try to focus on those themes as much as possible in the book, and want the book to be perceived as an effort to work through those themes in a constructive way, but they don't, to me, invalidate what's good about the Western intellectual tradition or about the commitment to the West in American foreign policy. And I think that we need to, sort of work on perpetuating what's good about this path, because things don't perpetuate themselves in and of themselves. They have to, if you want an idea to succeed in politics, you have to advocate for it. And so that's what I tried to do in the book. But at the same time, I am very concerned with how the idea of the West can be misapplied, and not just contributing to racism or prejudice within the United States, but it can also be misapplied internationally. And that, to me, is the crusading. I think that when you go on the crusade path, and it's not just spreading your ideas or setting a certain example, but you spread your ideas at the barrel of a gun. Or in the case of Christopher Columbus, who I don't think was trying to spread the West, I think he had other ideas and principles in mind. But if it's the case of Christopher Columbus, you're sort of spreading ideas with the sword. There I think a lot of crimes have committed, and a lot of immense foreign policy blunders have been initiated. And so I spent a lot of time in the book on the Vietnam War, which was a mistake, as I judge it, in American foreign policy, and it was a mistake in the name of the West. It was the war was conceived by policymakers as a defense of the Western alliance, as a kind of,
and then you had LBJ extending the war so he could boost his poll numbers.
Well, you had that too. You have the kind of cynicism and opportunism that drove the war as well. And then, of course, for people closer to our moment in time, the major crusade, not quite in the name of the West, but in the name of democracy, certainly, was the Iraq War. And it's a failed crusade. It
created a power vacuum,
trillions of dollars of expenditure,
the Islamic State,
of civilians who lost their lives, the empowerment of Iran. I mean, we think we kind of know the whole litany of bad things that follow from the Iraq War, but it's that crusading mentality. It's the very starting point of the book, as you know, that George W. Bush comes back from Camp David, 4 or 5 days after September 11th, and he's asked about what he's going to do, and he mentions that he's going to launch a crusade.
Do you think he was really even thinking when he said that? Like, part of me is like, it was kind of just one of those Bushisms. He's not really. He knows what what he wants to say, but he's not paying attention to the words he's using.
He's not paying attention. That's true. I mean, he's doing what human beings do, and presidents, and sort of speaking off the cuff. On the other hand, as I try to show in the paragraphs after citing, from that episode, Eisenhower refers to his core mission in 1952 when he's running for president as a crusade. Harry Truman refers to the early Cold War as a crusade. Woodrow Wilson refers to the First World War as a crusade, is buried in the city of Washington at the National Cathedral beneath a crusader's sword. The details sort of extraordinary, if it's really true that the city of Washington is laid out to resemble a crusader's shield. So crusading is not, a trivial motif in American foreign policy and American political culture.
It's kind of a romantic one.
Yeah, romantic one. So it's not, I think, an accident that George W. Bush invoked it at that moment. There's even, I think I mentioned this in the book, it's my favorite example, a crusade to end all wars. That was sort of an initiative that was launched in the 1920s. It's just so delightfully contradictory to crusade in the name of peace. But that's how prominent crusading has been. And so, I would not advocate crusading in the name of the West. I think that that's something that the U.S. should steer clear of. But in terms of representing or embodying certain Western principles,
or exchange ideas, voluntary exchange. Yeah.
Yes, in a spirit of tolerance and multiculturalism, I think that that's an idea worth defending in the present, and I try to do it in the book. But you mentioned the present moment, and I think that there's one particular conflict where crusading could be very, very dangerous, and that's in Belarus at the moment.
Okay, I don't know that much about what's going on in Belarus. If you want to,
sure. For me, as an outside observer, and I think many Americans feel this way, when you see that there were protests last summer, when you see how tyrannical, bloodthirsty, crazy the Belarusian president Lukashenko is, you naturally root for democracy in the country. You root for the protesters, and you would like to see them succeed. You would certainly like to see a better future for that country. On the other hand, this is a country where the military, the Belarusian and Russian militaries, are integrated. Russia has very, very strong interests there.
They're trying to make it a vassal state, basically, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's halfway there, but Putin is certainly contemplating making it 100% a vassal state, and I don't think that project, in the practical sense, would be all that difficult for Putin. You've got two countries that border Belarus that are NATO member states, Lithuania and Poland. You've got Russian territory close by, the sort of little satellite of Russia is called Kaliningrad. That's there, not too far from the border. So it's a dangerous area. And if we think that by invoking the virtues of a democratic future in Belarus, we can bring that future about, or that will be done without conflict with Russia, we have to be very, very careful. So it's not a matter of supporting democracy. I think that in a sort of subtle fashion we should do, and we should set a good example that may attract Belarusians over time to democracy, but we also shouldn't go about waving the flag of democracy too militantly in a kind of crusading fashion, because I think that could well lead to...
It just turns people off.
What's that?
It just turns people off from those ideas, because they're they'll associate the ideas with like...
I think Belarusians would be happy to be supported in the path to democracy, but I think...
Oh yeah, no, I just meant in general, not necessarily Belarus, but like the Middle East would be a...
Yeah, well, Middle East is in some ways much more complicated, but at the very least, we should have Libya and Iraq in mind when we think about what happens in the future in Belarus, and also just be very careful not to move toward any kind of direct military confrontation with Russia. And so, I'm very happy to sort of invoke this problem with crusading in that context. It's sort of, crusading points us to, in some ways, the best and the worst in American foreign policy.
Yeah, and you see this,
ideal,
and you see this with even like non-military stuff too. Like, I mean, especially like worded as a crusade, like the civil rights movement too. They framed it in that way, and then and then going back to trying to think of another. I had another example that I was thinking of, but I forgot. But like,
like a very worthy crusade to me. But abroad, the stakes are often different, and we often have much less understanding of the terrain abroad, and it's where the crusades, or that sort of crusading impulse can do so much damage.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and then because like the way I see it, and maybe I've just read too much Kissinger, but the way I almost see it is it's either going to be Russia and China versus the U.S. or Russia and the U.S. versus China. And the only the reason I think that a Russia-U.S. thing would be viable, and I'm not ideologically pro Putin or Russia or anything by any means, but it just seems like that could be something to potentially work to counter China, given that there are more cultural similarities, relatively speaking, than to China. And because like a lot of the reason like China and Russia have been working so closely together is because they're both afraid of each other as well. And they're trying to mitigate that as much as possible. They're on each other's borders, especially with Russia, been a superpower in decline since the 70s.
I think that the scenario you're laying out will be very difficult. To realize. Nobody quite knows the degree of proximity between Russia and China at the moment. It's possible, I think, to exaggerate it, but in some ways, the affinity is also quite real. So geographically, of course, they're close to one another. Soviet Union and Communist China had connections to a certain point when they came into conflict with each other. And I think most significantly, these two countries are sort of the major authoritarian powers in the world, and see a commonality of interest in that respect. They approach media, they approach civil disobedience and discontent in their own societies in a similar fashion.
The governments are popular too, so it almost says something about the culture, maybe.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, it's hard to know how popular Putin is, and I know far too little about China to speak about the popularity of these regimes. One thing with authoritarian regimes, I think it's just popularity is truly difficult to know. You can underestimate it, and you can overestimate it, but there is that affinity.
Wilson, we don't really even know how popular Wilson truly was.
That's for sure, but So in a kind of very general sense, I think that there is something bringing China and Russia together, and I don't think the U.S., regardless of what it does, really can, sort of prevent that from happening. At the same time, also, and we'll sort of see how this plays out with the summit between Putin and Biden on the 16th of June, but there's no trust between Russia and the United States at the moment, and so you can't will that into being overnight, and it would have to be a very, very long process. I mean, even the prospect of sort of a very pragmatic partnership between these two countries feels impossibly distant.
Yeah, I see Russia balkanizing before that could happen.
At the present moment. So I think the most you could hope for if you want to see a change of course between Russia and the U.S. is that they'll be able to manage crises a bit better than they've been able to do in the last couple of months, that they'll engage in sort of deconfliction and maybe in the Arctic and in space and, Iran, JCPOA, climate change. There'll be a few areas where pragmatic cooperation is possible, but it's going to be a long phase of tension between these two countries, certainly for the next 5 or 10 years. So it will be very interesting to see how China, Russia, and the U.S. either coalesce, come together in some ways, or diverge and enter into more direct conflict. That's sort of the question of geopolitics at the moment. But when it comes to the West and the United States, and this is where I end up with the book, rather than seeking partnerships with Russia or China or sort of other countries like that, my recommendation is that the U.S. should work on its relationship with Europe, which has been doing pretty well for the last couple of months. And more than anything, whether you call it Western or not, the U.S. should just try to embody what's best in its political tradition. And by doing so, and doing so credibly, that has a very good effect internationally. When the U.S. sort of represents itself well, with dignity, with principle, and these kinds of things, that's sort of the best gift that it can give to its own foreign policy. So, we have plenty of examples of that in the past. I try to cover as many as I can in the book and to discover in them something of a precedent for the future.
So this is kind of like a fun speculative one in a sense. This is the one I wanted to end with anyway, but so you see a lot of these historians we were talking about earlier, specifically like Arnold Toynbee, Carroll Quigley too, who was actually Bill Clinton's favorite professor when he was at Georgetown. No, but so they when they were writing about their like theory about like sort of at the end stage of civilization's life is what they refer to as a universal state. When you see like one major political force or empire controlling the entire or almost the entire cultural sphere of influence. Do you see the quote unquote Western world going in that direction at this point in time? Like, could you potentially see a almost not necessarily like traditional united Western empire in the same way like that Rome was, because of course we have different institutions and different international structures that allow for cohesion. But do you see the potential rise of some kind of Western universal state?
Well, I would hope not. It sounds, sort of far too ambitious and sort of gargantuan a project. Also for the United States, significant as the transatlantic relationship is, there are the hemispheric relationships that the United States has with Canada, with Mexico, with the
Like, do you see that? Do you see that centralizing potentially? I'm not saying like a good thing or a bad thing, but
not necessarily. I mean, it seems like a fairly fragmented period on the international scene, but in addition to the sort of hemispheric frame that the U.S. has for its foreign policy, there's also the countries of Asia, and that's of increasing prominence in there. As I sort of state in the conclusion of my book, the accentuation of Western ideas, Western narratives can be counterproductive. So I wouldn't want to see the U.S. become a part of some sort of Western superstate. It seems like it would just be too costly for the other relationships that matter as much, and in some cases at the moment more than the relationship with Europe. And this is the point that I could conclude on. The transatlantic relationship at the moment, although it's improving, is enormously difficult. European Union is very complicated unto itself. NATO and European Union and NATO are not, identical in terms of the countries that are members. NATO is very difficult to administer and to manage. You have a NATO partner at the moment, like Turkey, which is
nearby. Yeah, I was literally about to say Turkey's being a bit of a wild card right now.
Formally speaking, an ally of the United States, but in many respects going against American interests. So before the U.S. would contemplate anything sort of bigger than what it already has in the transatlantic relationship, there's the requirement that what currently exists has to be made modern, has to be made functional, sort of has to be managed in a decent way. And that seems like a pretty stupendous task. And then very finally, when you think of challenges like climate change, there I think the Western frame is not very helpful. Climate change, if it doesn't incorporate, sort of China and the countries of Africa and the countries of
India,
of the Middle East, it's just not going to work. So there's also a kind of global imagination. Forgive me, James Burnham, for putting it this way, but there's a global imagination that's also important. And the pandemic year has also very much underscored that. You've seen too little European and American partnership, a little bit on vaccine creation, but not so much on vaccine distribution. That would be nice to see more of that, but that would be completely insufficient to dealing with the problem. I mean, I think that there's just a much greater need for information sharing, for technological cooperation, for a kind of global partnership in dealing with pandemics. It is in the interest of all of us to
a bit of a wake-up call.
So. Right, and that would be desirable. So I think we should maintain what we have with Europe in the United States, but I wouldn't go too much beyond that. And at the same time, I would sort of work on the global priorities that are very acutely felt at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Kimmage. Again, I'm sorry for the delay at first. But everybody, The Abandonment of the West, it is out right now in hardcover. Please support brick and mortar bookstores. Only go to Amazon if your brick and mortar bookstore doesn't have it. But either way, again, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Kimmage. It was a pleasure having you on.
Great. A pleasure being here. Take care. Good luck.